Well, welcome everybody. Julian, thanks for being here. We're in a slightly mischievous mood today. I think it's sort of like end of school term, isn't it?
It is. I hope we don't muck up too much.
I really do hope we don't muck up too much. And I'm slightly nervous. We've bitten off more than we can chew with the agenda today.
There's not much going on.
There's not much going on. So look, really have to talk about to be vaccinated or not be vaccinated. I'm sure somebody's going to write a play called that shortly, but we'll spend some time on that. Really want to talk about sort of what the workplace is going to look like next year and sort of some of the big issues, and certainly what we might call the workplace law agenda for 2022. But of course, we've got to have a federal election sometime.
There's that.
So We'll talk about that and a few other things. And as always, we'll try and take your questions as we go. Julian and I will be having a little
We've
look.
also taken plenty of questions, and so we've built this.
Most of the questions in if we can.
Exactly.
Yeah, we can. So welcome everybody. Last one for the year. See how we go. So look, where are we in the pandemic? Today, I think we took the view we're not going to talk about public health orders. We're not going to talk about public health directions down in Victoria because we're really moving to a world where that's passing. And I really want to focus more on sort of the world we will be in when we get out of the public health orders completely and when we get out of the public health directions. And a couple of things we should say about that, I think, before we kick off. It's going to be a challenge the next few months from a workplace employer perspective. I think it'll keep being a bit of a challenge probably into the new year. We've obviously spent the last couple of years in what we might call a containment strategy around the country, trying to eliminate or not allow COVID-19 to get away with itself.
It's the shutdown.
We've got
to shut it down. We've got to close it down.
Close it down. Yep. We then sort of, particularly in Victoria and New South Wales, sort of admitted defeat a little bit on that. And we've now moved to what I call a vaccination strategy, and we're going to learn to live with it strategy.
Exactly.
I think the great challenge we'll have from a workplace perspective over the next few months is obviously that's got different timing and different emphasis around the country. So if you've got a business in Queensland and you're also running a business in Victoria, you're going to have to understand the nuance of how we deal with that. So that's probably the contextual problem that most of us are going to face as we go into the next couple of months.
You also might have customers in different states. You might have
different expectations.
Exactly. So it's a necessary complication, but I think people will eventually get there. But for now, it's not all neatly tied together.
Not neat and tidy. And in that context, we probably want to sort of say there's three lenses going forward. There's what we might call the community standard of risk lens. There's the customer standard of risk lens. And then, of course, there's the workplace standard of risk lens. I'll start on the left very quickly. The fact of the matter is that very shortly, be you vaccinated, be you unvaccinated, from a community perspective, we're all in this together. And there's probably shortly not going to be too many rules saying vaccinated people this, unvaccinated that. Certainly as we get into next year, most of that's going to start to dissipate. Certainly in New South Wales and other places in Australia.
Yeah, I should also say, in terms of what we're going to talk about today, we're not focusing necessarily on the nitty-gritty of details and precise dates for two reasons. One,
I think most people know them.
Three reasons then. Most people know them. Two, the purpose of today is to start thinking about what 2022
is really
post-pandemic looks like. But also, I mean, you never know when these things could change. You really don't. You really do. So no promises. I mean, I spent last night listening to us talking in this studio 9 months ago and us sort of opining on what might happen in the pandemic. And, I think a lot of the stuff we said, you can check it on YouTube if you'd like to have a look, was correct. But we never knew what was going to happen in between then and now. So we don't know what's going to happen.
So I think going forward at the moment, we're talking to most people about, well, how do you want to manage this with your customers, particularly if you're in a very customer-centric, customer-facing part of the economy. And obviously we're talking about workplace and what you're going to do in the workplace. And as we're going to talk about very quickly today, that's really now shifted around to, and is going to continue to shift around to, work health and safety obligations and how you implement various measures to manage those. I feel nervous saying this, but I think
you feel nervous.
Yeah. We keep getting people keep saying to us, surely there is a definitive study that tells us that vaccinations prevent transmission of the virus.
Surely there's a definitive study that vaccinations tick every box, and they are the answer for every problem that an employer might have.
And the fact of the matter is, what do we know scientifically at the moment? Whoever you read around the world, we know that the vaccines, whichever one you use, very, very useful if you actually contract the virus, develop the disease. They prevent you developing a really bad case of the disease, and it seems very strong likelihood will prevent you going to hospital.
Or dying.
Absolutely.
I mean, this is why I got vaccinated.
That's why you got vaccinated.
Great reason to get vaccinated.
Outside of that, we don't have a definitive study saying they stop transmission, but it's very true to say, and I'll say this with some care, there's a very strong professional opinion developing. If you go to a Target's website and other websites, there's a professional opinion that it does actually help with transmission.
Yes.
And if you look at what's going on in some of the court cases that have been happening over the last month, New South Wales Supreme Court and various others, a number of judges are starting to adopt this view that that opinion has some weight.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the medical perspective. Let's start with customers. Can I prevent people coming in, Julian, if they're not vaccinated?
If I can be prevented from entering premises because I don't have a shirt or shoes on, then I can certainly be prevented from entering a premise because I'm not vaccinated. But in the same way, you do need to ensure as a business when you're enforcing vaccination rules for your customers that you're not breaching anti-discrimination laws. Some good examples on the screen there. Obviously, some people with a disability can't get vaccinated for various reasons. I mean, most children, I think maybe all children, can't get vaccinated right now. That might progressively change, but obviously you're going to have to be careful not to fall foul of anti-discrimination laws when you're enforcing those kind of rules for your customers.
Yeah, but bottom line is it's probably increasingly now a business decision.
100%, and what we're hearing universally is maybe not too much, but we're hearing a lot of the expectation, Nigel, Julian, is that we are going to have a premises where people are vaccinated. Our clients, our customers, our patrons want to come into a premises knowing that everyone's vaccinated and that they're not going into, into a place where there might be unvaccinated people, and that's having effect in the decisions employers are making about how to apply vaccination rules for their customers.
Absolutely. Now, of course, you've got then the other challenge, which is if you're going to have customers vaccinated, you're going to have your employees vaccinated. We'll come on to that.
Yes.
You've also got the other challenge of you're going to have to manage the sensitivity of actually making sure customers are vaccinated. And what do you do if somebody fronts up who isn't? And are your staff trained to deal with that?
Deal with checking vaccination certificates, but also dealing with the kind of behaviour that you occasionally see pop up in the media of someone wanting to make a point about not being able to come into the premises on the basis of their vaccination status. So it's not as straightforward as simply telling the receptionist in your office, don't let anyone in without a vaccination green tick. It's more nuanced than that. You need to plan.
Probably train your staff.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Let's talk about the workplace and workers if we can. This is probably well known now because I think we've probably said this now for about 3 or 4 webcasts, but just very quickly. Ever since the pandemic started, we've had people saying to us, can you help me rewrite employment contracts for new employees? And we've been rewriting some contracts for people saying that the employer can direct them to get vaccinated for various things. So in terms of that new employee situation, you can actually give the direction to vaccinate. It's not really an issue in that sense. For existing employees, more complicated. I've not seen a sort of pre-pandemic employment contract that said anything about vaccinations in any way, shape, or form. You might have done.
In some industries, there would be pre-pandemic contracts that had you have to get a flu shot. You had in the same way
childcare,
exactly
aged care.
I haven't seen anyone with the foresight to include a general vaccination obligation before now, but obviously now we've got them in.
So we're down into this world of, for existing employees, giving them a direction, and is that direction both lawful and reasonable? And reasonableness, unfortunately, is quite contextual. We'll come on to whether or not this will actually get definitively answered shortly in a proceeding.
Yes.
We'll have a chat about that very quickly in a moment. Look, what's this resting on? What's this being anchored to at the moment? It's being anchored predominantly as we go forward to work health and safety obligations. We talked about these at length about 6 months ago. I don't want to spend too much time on them today. But obviously, as the controller of the premises, as the employer, primary duty of care to make sure the workplace is safe. And the proposition, very simply, is to do all things reasonably practicable to achieve that. And it's that what is reasonably practicable in the situation. Now, where do you start with WHS obligations? You start with a risk assessment. And there's probably two sorts of people we've talked to in the last few weeks. There's the people who rang up and said, yeah, I'm doing it anyway.
Yeah.
I don't care about this. And if I face an unfair dismissal case, I'll face it. And then there's people who rang up and said, yeah, look, I really want to try and get this, cross the T's, dot the I's. First thing I would say if you're going to do a risk assessment is understand what risk you're actually assessing. They're quite different. We talked about this with a client, I think, a week ago. Are you looking at the risk of transmission?
The answer to what risk are you trying to mitigate against isn't the pandemic or COVID. It has to be more specific than that. And this must infuriate you because you're a safety guy. You're really serious about safety. You like these
I like the matrix.
Matrices, which are on the slide there. So you have to be specific. You have to drill down because if you are going to the level of detail to assess risks, assess probabilities, you need to identify what risk you're actually.
Yeah, because you walked in my room and wrote pandemic, and I went, no, that's not true. That's not it. So just think of that carefully, because obviously how you might assess the probability and the consequence of transmission against the probability and consequence of if somebody develops COVID, having a severe case of COVID, be they vaccinated or unvaccinated, it's actually going to change how you actually assess the risk in relation to those criteria. If you haven't used a risk assessment tool template before and you don't have one, drop us a line at info@ablawyers. I think that's it. Is it .com? We'll find out at the end of the presentation.
Yeah, email address is usually end in .com. .com.au.
We'll just give you ours. It's fine. You can have it. If that helps you, that's fine. The general proposition, obviously, in any risk assessment is to introduce controls to minimise the level of risk you've assessed, and we've put up there the general hierarchy: eliminate, substitute, engineer, administrative, PPE. We'll talk about this, I think, in a few minutes. Yep. There's a lot of PPE controls that still need to be considered, not just vaccinate or not vaccinate. And really, vaccination in some senses is probably an administrative control, because what you're really saying is you can't come to work unless you are. And that's really the control's really not coming to work.
Yep.
I suspect if you're asking people to be vaccinated to manage the risk of severe COVID, it's probably nudging more towards an engineering control, given the quality of medical information on the effect of vaccinations on stopping hospitalisation and the like.
Well, vaccines are the thing to keep you out of hospital if you pick it up.
Hence, I start with it's important to understand what risk you're trying to control in the first place. Just remember, and we'll talk about this in a sec, but mandating vaccinations is just one control. And I get very nervous at the moment. We saw a company we were talking to last week. We said, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? And it's like, oh yeah, well, I don't want to talk about them anymore.
The thing about the list of thises that you've just given. I mean, we've been living with face masks. We've been living with QR codes. We've been living with social distancing, sanitizers, ventilation, working from home as a
not having the office fully stacked.
Keeping a record of who's where, when, visitor control, all of these things. The idea that you would simply dismiss all of those things, throw them out the window, and think, well, all of our answers are vaccine related, it's not gonna cut the mustard if you have to run a case about it. But it also goes against the risk assessment and the health and safety principles, which you're such a fan of, Nigel. In that this is about a hierarchy of control, and some of you on the line, or on the webcast at least, will know the Swiss cheese model, where there are holes. There's holes in the protection of vaccines, but you cover those holes by laying the cheese of controls over the top.
And the one thing that I will say is just be very mindful of consultation, and we'll talk about that again in a moment, but just be very mindful of what strict WHS consultation obligations you might have, if you've actually identified under the legislation, model legislation across the country, if you've identified under the legislation a particular process for consulting with your employees, be it a committee, a forum or whatever, just be mindful that if you're going to start talking about mandating vaccinations or introducing other controls, you've got obligations to actually use those actually identified forums. We've seen a few clients sort of slip up on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's an even more basic point. I think everyone's aware, or a lot of people are aware of consultation obligations arising under enterprise agreements or modern awards, but there's separate and slightly different obligations arising under the Work Health and Safety Act. For a lot of employers, my sense is they haven't really needed to engage with that consultation under the Work Health and Safety Act very often before.
Because they've had health orders, health directions.
Yeah, or they haven't had to live through a pandemic where basically everyone going to work is subject to this particular and really serious, in some cases, risk. So consultation.
But also, if it's WHS, consultation in the context of WHS consultation obligations.
Absolutely.
And if you're struggling with that, please give us a call. Factors to consider in all of that, and I think we've probably taken people through this before. We might just touch on, as Julian said, you think about all the other controls you could put in to reduce risk in this context: masks, sanitisation, rapid antigen testing.
We didn't talk about rat.
No, we haven't. No, we haven't talked about rat.
Yeah,
I'm going to let you. I'm not a fat.
I'm not going to declare my fandom or otherwise of rat testing. Clearly, that's going to play a bigger role. Clearly, it's much more available. There's lots of different producers of rat testing. We'll talk about it.
I'm concerned about the cost.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was buying my breakfast banana and milkshake the other morning at the supermarket, at the counter there was some rapid antigen testing that I could have just bought. So
how much?
It was like $40.
Yeah, so I was $40.
But,
yeah, $40.
In any case, we'll talk about a case where we might find a bit more about what the Fair Work Commission might think
about rat.
About rat, exactly.
Yeah, okay. And probably the big one I want to highlight there is one at the bottom. Please think this one through, and that is, if you are going to ultimately introduce mandatory vaccinations, have a very clear picture as to what you're going to do with the people who may have, one, refused to vaccinate, and also you need to be very mindful of, you might have people who've got a medical contraindication certificate, and if you're actually managing this from a risk perspective, are you going to treat them as being unvaccinated, which they are, even though they might have had a medical reason for not getting it, which brings in discrimination issues. And so when you're thinking that through, I would say, please give us a call, because that one gets a bit sticky. A couple of questions, Jules, if I can. I'll put you on the spot.
Yeah.
Let's say I mandate vaccinations and somebody says I haven't been vaccinated. First step would be issue.
Well, going back, I'm going to assume in this
consulted to death.
Consulted to death. I'm assuming there's no public health order which is floating about, which makes your job easier to make that direction.
Lengthy consultation period, really engaged, had some incentives to try and promote vaccinations. I've still got some people who haven't done it.
The point at where it kicks off, so to speak, is the issue of a very clear direction to get vaccinated.
And this would be in writing?
It'd be in writing. It would identify the relevant timeframes as to, and what was the expectation. We've seen some people, we need evidence of you getting the appointment. Some people, we need evidence of the fact you've got your first jab. Some people, second jab. Sometimes first jab plus evidence of the appointment for the second jab.
And let's say I've issued that direction. I've then got some really interesting things to consider, which is, how long's a reasonable period of time to give the person? Because obviously with these vaccinations, you have to have a period of time in between jab 1 and jab 2. So it's not simply going to be, if you're not vaccinated in a day, I'm going to sack you. I don't think it's that. It's got to be more considered than that.
Exactly. That will depend on the consultation process that you've undertaken. It'll depend on what vaccine people get. It'll depend also on what's the effect on their, what are you going to do? Are they going to be on leave?
Leave without pay, what's your leave without pay policy?
Exactly. So,
and I suspect the sticky one then is going to be, hang on a minute, I've worked from home successfully for the last 2 years. Why can't I work from home indefinitely? And I'm going to say, well, now we're moving back to a formal request for flexible work arrangements, potentially under the Fair Work Act, potentially under an enterprise agreement, could be a number of those areas, and that's then going to have to be considered on its merits as well.
In the same way that if that person had made a request to work from home indefinitely three years ago in that beautiful fairyland we used to live in, you just assess it on that basis. No one has not no one, but people have a right to make flexibility request. It would be rare that an employee had a unilateral right to decide where they worked forever.
And as we said, as we speak, there's a case before the Fair Work Commission full bench, and our colleague Lewis Itzo's
probably being much more serious than us.
He's being far more serious than us at the moment. He grabbed that case and he sort of told us after the event. He's got a bit of an affection for this area. He really has. BHP mandated vaccinations for a mine in the Hunter Valley, and I think this is the Australian Workers Union. I think one or all of the unions involved said, not up for that. That's not lawful and reasonable direction. It's a little complicated because the dispute's actually under an enterprise agreement dispute procedure. Justice Ross, as he can do, he decided this was going to be the case, and he invited the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, who we're lucky to represent, to those proceedings, and Lewis is acting for the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry in the proceedings as we speak. And I suspect that Justice Ross and the full bench are probably going to try and use this to sort of lay some principles down about mandatory vaccination.
It's hugely helpful in that it has been flagged, given all the discussions papers that have been issued, all the questions that have been asked, the fact that the peak employer bodies and unions have been asked to come in.
ACTU's there as well.
It's going to set out a framework of how to deal with this. The actual case may be decided on the particular thing BHP
separate to that
may or may not have done, but it's clear that the Fair Work Commission wants to weigh in as it can, and in my personal opinion, as it should in this case. And so it's exciting and a bit of a relief to know that this is the case where we're going to get some more commentary, some real helpful commentary on a lot of material that we now have in front of us.
So look, just stay tuned on that, because as soon as we get a decision, which, knowing the way Justice Ross works, will be sooner rather than later. I think it'll probably be fairly fast. We'll get something out to you so you understand exactly what guidance that's given. In the meantime, we've had a few unfair dismissal cases.
A couple. I mean, it's interesting because so far unfair dismissal cases take a while to get to the actual commission. We've had a very, I call it the Sapphire case, a very prominent case, which I'm sure many webinars have mentioned, about a mandatory flu vaccine for a childcare worker, which didn't go the way of the childcare worker. We've had some weirder kind of constitutional type arguments run in different forums around Australia. I think it's fair to say, for the most part, employers' right to mandate in the specific circumstances that have been looked at, particularly around public health orders, have been upheld. We haven't had any. Employers haven't been kicked yet,
that's true.
As far as I'm aware, in terms of unfair dismissal. This will happen, though.
Yes,
this will happen.
It's going to happen at some point.
And it's going to happen not necessarily because everyone's been wrong about vaccines, or necessarily because vaccines aren't useful or whatever. It's going to happen because someone won't consult, or someone will issue a direction which is clearly unreasonable, or someone may not have assessed the risk in an appropriate way.
And I think that's the kicker in this sense. If somebody comes and says, look, I've got a mandatory policy for vaccinations and I've just terminated someone's employment, filed for unfair dismissal, we're going to start by saying, did you do a risk assessment? Can we have a look at the risk assessment? And we're going to be trying to sort of go back to all of that to understand, what consultation process did you have to try and make an evaluation as to, how fair what has occurred.
Look, an employee might ask for an extra 3 weeks, and an employer might say, no, I'm not giving you 3 weeks, and that may be the thing that makes it unfair. You just don't know.
And then the last issue is, and we had a few questions probably over the last year about this. If I encourage people to get vaccinated, or I now mandate vaccinations, if something goes wrong for the employee with the vaccine, can I be liable?
Yes, I mean, under first principles. I mean, particularly if you've facilitated the employee getting vaccinated, there's definitely a liability there. There is a federal scheme set up, which I think that it starts at $5,000 and goes up.
No, I should say I'm not as bullish as Julian. I'm a bit.
Yeah, well, I mean,
I'm just bullish. I think the question of the nexus between them getting independent medical advice and the like, and they're not going to get vaccinated on the premises and things like that. So I must say I'm not quite as bullish as you around that, but there is a scheme now.
First time for everything.
First time for everything. Yeah.
If you don't know about the scheme, look for the scheme. I think the point would be is that there's a theoretical option that employers might be liable for. And
there's a scheme that's been set up to actually provide some form of compensation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For the more serious.
To protect employers.
That's right.
Yeah. Well,
we're flying.
We're flying. That's the vaccine. What's the workplace going to look like next year? We won't talk about. Let's talk about 4 things.
Yes.
Obviously, working from home, and I wrote my list out. Julian said, "How do you want to start this?" And I just want to start it by talking about what I've learned talking to clients in the last year. You might we'll see if I haven't read in my list yet. You might disagree. We'll just have to find out. It's been really great if you're experienced and you've got a really good network in terms of the company, the customers and whatever. So, if I'm 55 and I've been around a long time and I've really got the job sorted, it's been pretty good for me to work from home. I can do it quite comfortably. That's proposition number 1. We've learned that people hate to travel long distances to go to work. I'm not shocked by that. I think we probably knew that before, but they've now tasted the other side of the equation.
I think they hate public transport.
They hate public transport. That might be it. I just think sitting in a car for an extended period of time now is something we're all going to sort of fight against a little bit. It's an interesting period. Early career people have suffered. I've got no doubt about that. Early career people have really missed out on that informal mentoring, the chat with the more experienced colleague, the ability to have guidance. And in some cases, I've actually seen early career people almost sort of disappear into the ether almost because they're just not around. So I think early career people have suffered generally.
Yeah, I mean, they're not there to take the hints either.
Yeah, no, yeah.
So in that sense, management, I mean, who knows? Maybe there's criticism for management in not doing enough. I mean, it's much, much harder to manage by email. But, yeah, I think early career people have suffered, even if they don't particularly realise that they've suffered.
Yeah, we've had this talk with some of the younger career people in our actual office in Sydney, and when we started talking about what they might have actually experienced, it was like, gosh, yes, you're right. You're absolutely right.
A lot of them are hyper conscientious and sort of were like, oh, I know I really want to be around it. I want to be involved because in our line of work, like in many lines of work, sometimes it matters whether you're there for something that comes up.
The next one I learned is if you're 24 years of age, it's not much fun working from home in a share house. It's really easy for me to sit in my house in Belgala and go, hey, I've got my own study. Julian had the best study ever. It was like a studio, wasn't it? It was
still have it.
It's quite extraordinary. But if you're in a share house, it's not much fun. I hadn't realised this, but most people I spoke to under the age of about 30-ish said they lost most of their social life because a lot of their social life was related to the Friday night drinks after work.
Your work.
So that I learnt that. I probably knew this beforehand, but I'll say it again. Enduring culture is built face to face, and it's built in the small moments. I've met a lot of people who go, oh yeah, our cultural surveys around employee satisfaction is as good as ever. Yeah, that might be true, but long-term sustainable enduring culture is built face to face. It's built in the small moments, and I think you forget that at your peril. My next one is it's very clear that some people actually want to work full-time from home. And my answer is if you want to be a subcontractor, why don't you make them a subcontractor? Because if somebody's going to now work permanently away from the office, I'm not actually, or the workplace as a whole, I think they probably are becoming a subcontractor. And you might actually want to consider whether or not you want to change your engagement model of that person, or you actually want to change your remuneration model to being outcome focused rather than time focused?
You're speaking about them becoming a subcontractor in a philosophical sense, as opposed to a legal sense.
I possibly might even move Julian into a legal sense as well. So I learned that. One thing, I spoke to a couple of clients last week and the week before. They've had people sneakily relocate during COVID. They sort of woke up and said, hey, we just found out that Julian now lives on the Sunshine Coast.
This is so much more common than anyone would have thought. And it all lines up quite nicely, actually, because everyone's been at home for ages. Everyone's moving out of capital cities. The regional housing market's going gangbusters. Not a lot of it, but at least some of it is because your employees have moved, and a lot of the management problems, whether it be getting people back into work, getting paid, like performance managing people, getting them coming, sometimes it's because they literally moved cities.
Yeah.
Challenging.
And because that then begs the question, which is, if you've moved to the Sunshine Coast, why am I paying the Sydney wages?
No comments.
No comment on that. Yes, Julian didn't move to the Sunshine Coast, it's fine. But I think that's an question. There's some really interesting literature in the States at the moment about people moving basically interstate in the United States. And there's I think Google, some interesting stuff coming out of Google and places like that, of they're being very supportive of remote workers. Given the nature of the work, they probably can. But the question then is, well, if you're going to go and live in Arizona, why am I paying you what I used to pay you for living in California, where the cost of living is so high? So just, that's a consideration as well as to how that fits into your remuneration planning going forward. If you are going to encourage or endorse what I would call not working from home, but remote working, what's that going to do in terms of your strategy around remuneration and where you put yourself in the market?
Particularly if you've got a mixed model with some people in, some people working remotely. There's fairness elements to it that you need to work out, because if you need some people in and you're allowing some people to go, and it's clearly better to work remotely, you might end up with a problem.
And I've got two more, then I want to kick off with an insight and see how you respond to the insight. But okay. I have started to see some cultural tensions in businesses between blue and white collar. And that is blue collar, come to work, go into the factory, go into the concrete plant, go into the mine. White collar still able to be, quote, flexible, have work-life integration at a level that the blue collar can't. And I was dealing with a client a couple of weeks ago who said there's a real sense of resentment developing between blue collar and white collar. And I haven't got an answer for that at the moment, but what I would say is just start to think about what your internal messaging is about, and whether or not that messaging is really only supporting one part of your workforce and not another part of your workforce. And if so, how's that other part of the workforce feeling? Because it probably feels like it's missing out pretty badly. And if you're not careful, you'll start to drive a wedge. So you want to be very careful about that messaging. Then I'd have to say this, I think it's here to stay. In some form or fashion, it's here to stay. I'm going to give you what I think is my biggest insight. You can tell me what your biggest insight is. But in terms of staying, I think what's probably going to happen is a couple of things. One is, I think if you're competing with other companies who offer this flexibility and you don't, I think you are going to be less attractive in the market. That's the first insight I would say. So it's not even so much what you might want to do, it's what might be happening in the market you compete for labour and talent in. And the second one I would say, and I think we've proved this ourselves a little bit, is if you're going to have a hybrid regime, you have to be pretty particular about getting everybody in the office at the same time at some point. It's no point saying I want everybody in 3 days a week and everybody chooses a different 3 days. It'd be much better to say it's going to be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or whatever, because you need a certain level of density in the office to recreate the atmosphere and the collaboration and the integration. And they're probably the two things I'd probably say more than ever as you move forward. If you are thinking hybrid, think about those.
Completely agree. The interesting part about the second point is, and I read an article 2 days ago about how that kind of feeds into the idea of the 4-day week. I've personal view, but working on a hybrid model, it's so fun to come into the office. It's so fun to come into the office because you see people, and if you've got 3 days or whatever, and then when you have a day at home, it's this heavy focus time. It actually really breaks it up quite nicely in a way that you couldn't quite do if you're just working one or the other. It has to be here to stay. I mean, I don't want to mention the Great Resignation.
The Great Resignation. Well, you just did.
Yeah, I shouldn't have said it. But obviously, there's a developing expectation. It falls into, young,
but particularly in the professional world.
Yeah.
In the professional world, I'd probably agree with that. I think they're probably what I would say you want to be thinking about as you start to work through in the new year. Am I going to more formally start to respond to hybrid working arrangements or whatever? Have all of those sort of key things in the back of your mind that we've just talked about, and make sure you're discussing and addressing them and finding the right balance for you and your workplace, what you actually have to do, and the culture. That brings us to 2, which is I think some companies do this well. In fact, some companies do it really well. Some companies do it really, really badly.
Or don't do it at all.
Or don't do it at all. And that is, just be very mindful that as we start to possibly consider the employee's home genuinely being the workplace, you're going to have to start to think far more systematically about how am I going to assess risks in that home if it is the workplace. Am I going to have rules in that home about what the employee, when they're working or during working hours, can and can't do? That might take away some of the glamour of all this flexibility.
Yeah, my observation about this is that there's nothing over the top about thinking about that and enforcing some rules or applying some rules and some kind of structure as to a work health and safety framework at home. I mean, I think in the past particularly, there's some reticence because it's like, we don't want to tell someone what they can and can't do in their own home. It is their own home. It's also their workplace.
But it's now the workplace. They get injured. You've got problems.
Exactly.
You might have a WHS prosecution problem, but you certainly have a workers' compensation problem. So, in other words, in the new year, if you really are moving to a different model, really start to think about this more seriously and give us a call. Labour market shortage. I'm not going to talk about the Great Resignation because it annoys me.
That's why I brought it up.
I know, it just annoys me. I think it's more hype than true, but I think some people are just simply looking for change, and I can't sell the house, I can't leave my partner, I'm going to change my job. There's some truth in that. What I would say is that we are in a tight labour market. We're about 1 million workers short in Australia right now because of all of what's been going on. You could have a debate about how correct that number is, but it's around that. A lot of managers out there probably haven't managed in a tight labour market before. Can I just make 3 observations and we'll move on? Please don't panic. There'll be a tendency to start talking about we have to pay everybody lots more money. I suspect the tight labour market will dissipate in about a year, 18 months' time once the borders start to open up again. You don't want to find yourself with a remuneration scale that you can't ultimately afford. I would simply say this: work out who are the critical people in your business. Make sure that you've got them locked down, secured, culturally aligned. And if you've been, taking the piss a little bit with what you're paying them, fix that up quickly. But I'd be focusing on those key people rather than fundamentally changing my remuneration strategy in the short term.
Just because there's a shortage, as you say, don't panic. Don't pay too much for the wrong people.
Yeah. It's interesting in Manly right now, if you go to a coffee shop, they're literally, people working in coffee shops are swapping almost every week for an extra 50 cents an hour. And just in a year's time, when everybody starts coming back to live in Manly from overseas, the labour market's going to crash, and it'll be quite fascinating to watch. Cyber security. This is 20 seconds.
I'll do it in 10. Look, if you're working from home, the chances are that your technological systems, your file management, it's not as robust as it was before. I imagine that a lot of employers and a lot of people online have dealt with this over the last 2 years, but clearly if you're going to be working from home or that model is going to be adopted, you need to be working in people's home environments, their systems, shared networks, shared computers.
And the businesses that I get scared with aren't the really big ones and they're not the really small ones, the ones in the middle. They've kind of got scale. If they actually got a genuine phishing attack or a cyber attack, they could actually be in some commercial difficulty. and they probably at the moment don't see themselves as being big enough to really invest in the area and make sure that they are secure. Mm. So if you're in that kind of middle-sized business, I would say this is something you want to have on your management agenda for next year, just to make sure that if you are engaging a lot more remote working, how secure are we? Because you're right, most people have become more vulnerable from cyber attacks in the last 2 years than become more secure. There's no doubt about that. Was that optimistic for next year? I think it was reasonably optimistic. Quickly, some things to think about. COVID and workers' comp. New South Wales,
19B.
19B.
Early on in the pandemic, New South Wales legislated that for a whole raft of workers, if you got contracted the COVID-19, it would be assumed that you got it in your workplace, and therefore it would be compensable.
So see how sensible I'm being here, because I really wanted to say it's a really silly law to do.
Yeah, I've got no political judgment or opinion on it.
It's a really silly thing to do.
Anyway, our new Premier is pushing for that to be repealed to get it back into a more orthodox state. So if you're in New South Wales and you're interested in workers' comp, watch this space, because that's, if it hasn't happened
we'll let people know the minute it changes.
Yep.
At the moment, if you catch COVID-19, if you develop COVID-19, the disease, you can actually claim it on workers' comp. There's a presumption that it's actually been caught at work, which, given its community disease, seems a little strange to me. We talked a lot during the year about casual employment, the new changes to the Fair Work Act. You spent a lot of time cleaning up all the modern awards to reflect the Fair Work Act. It's probably old news, but what I would say is if you haven't thought about it, think about it. And we spent a lot of time in the last 6 months helping people rewrite casual employment contracts to fit that new world.
If you don't know what we're talking about when we're talking about the new world, call us, because it's you're late.
And probably a couple of quick things: harmonisation of labour hire regulations on the agenda for the Liberal Party. Bear with me, Queensland, Victoria, I always get South Australia.
100%. Ding dong.
Ding dong, got that one right. We'll keep you posted. I'm not sure. I think this might fall into the abyss.
There's not enough days of Parliament
left
to get it done, and then looming over the horizon
is the election.
The E word.
The E word, the election. And as we said last time Lewis and I were here, High Court case, Jamsec, big case for really going back into this, who's a contractor, who's an employee, has a lot to do in the space we spend a lot of time working in, which is this subcontract driver, lorry owner driver space. High Court's heard it.
They have.
You were there.
I was one of the few people admitted to the web link.
We were appearing
for the New South Wales Business Chamber.
Yeah.
Intervening. It's being there, it's very clear, given the High Court's questioning, that the High Court is going to do something with the age-old problem of contractor.
Who is, who isn't.
Who is, who isn't, walks like a duck, all of those things. A lot of clients it really does trouble them, and quite rightly so. Jamsec and another case that they're hearing at the same time, I think, is going to give a really thorough examination of the principles around that, and it'll be great. And as you say, particularly interested in our passion of lorry owner drivers. So if you've got owner drivers, you need to be keeping your ears out for Jamsec.
Sometime next year?
Yeah, definitely.
Sometime next year. And we'll as soon as it comes out, we'll let everybody know what the outcome is and what comes out of it. So don't please worry about that. But yeah, it'll be sometime in the new year. The High Court don't tend to rush.
But who knows? It may come out today. I don't know. We'll see. Whenever it comes out, I'm sure it will be great.
We'll just be fairly quick on these if we can, Jules. There's an interesting case at the moment going on involving an application by Menulog. It's the first kind of attempt by a gig economy company to try and get its own award, modern award. I'm going to be very careful what I say now because I'm appearing in the hearing.
You would say it's an interesting case since you're involved.
Menulog
have been very, very careful to say they are not the only. It's not going to be the Menulog award. It's about gig economy delivery drivers or couriers, basically, who traditionally have been contractors, but this is a modern award, so it would cover employees.
And I think just very quickly, for people who are interested in this area of the economy, be it Menulog, be it Amazon or whoever might be, particularly if you're in the transport sector, it'll be an interesting case because it's kind of lifting the veil of the mystique of gig and looking down at a group of workers who basically just career people who drive vehicles and motorbikes and
drop stuff off.
And behind the facade, it looks like a duck. It walks like a duck. It's probably a duck.
I thought you said you weren't.
I wasn't going to say very much. The domestic violence leave test case is back on.
Yeah, it's the domestic violence leave, family and domestic violence review. Everyone will know that there was a test case run some years ago, which again we were both involved in, which introduced entitled unpaid 5 days in modern awards. That was picked up now in the NES. It's back with a case, and the claim this time is for 10 days paid leave. Again, it's only for modern awards. That's going to be heard in the new year. We'll see what happens with that, because depending who is the government by the end of next year might change the relevance of that case.
We'll talk about quickly before we go. Some changes to migration law in Australia, and my understanding is, and we'll send some more stuff out about this if this bill does actually become law.
Yes.
It's currently in the Parliament. It's really trying to tighten up, making sure people are doing the right things when they engage migrant workers on certain visas. Much heavier penalties, as I understand, in the bill.
Offences, a banned employer list, some positive obligations to check people's visa status, and border force.
And there's some jail time in this as well, if you get it all wrong. I can't remember.
They may well be. I mean, they're criminal offences.
Yeah.
So this is for dealing with the more extreme forms of exploitation for
migrants on working visas.
Yeah, I should note, this is not just for people who run businesses picking fruit. There's many people who are employing people on visas, and this touches on it. Again, whether it gets done before the election,
don't know.
Not sure.
We'll watch this space. And there's a private members bill just dropped in, same job, same pay, which in a sense, as I understand it, we'll pick this up in a moment. That's essentially saying if you've got contractors, labour hire people working in, say, a cement manufacturing plant, they need to be paid the same as the people working there if they're doing the same work.
That's right. It's from the Labor Party. It's almost a bit of a sort of a flag for something.
It's a taste tester.
That's right.
It's a taste tester.
That's right. And as Nigel will change the slide as to what we think might happen, or perhaps not what we think might happen, but what might happen if I was Marty McFly and could get in the DeLorean.
Well, some of our viewers will be too young to remember the DeLorean, Julian.
Sad story. Anyway, so this is a future where.
So what happens if we have a federal election and Labor win? What can we expect?
Right. Exactly.
What can we expect? And we can expect quite a bit. Because look, to be fair, the Liberal Party had a pretty solid crack this year. I think that's fair to say.
The omnibus was
big.
Was big. It was ambitious, and it was ultimately ended up small,
and couldn't get crossbench support. Really, just couldn't get it through the Parliament. Again, don't know if we do have an election in the new year and Labor win. Don't know what the crossbenches will look like. Gut feel tells me traditionally the crossbenches have tended to be a little bit more pro-Labor than pro-Liberal, but who knows with what's going on at the moment with various splinter parties.
Anything could happen.
Anything could happen. But probably the big ticket items are, as we said, they're on the screen. We'll just quickly go through them. Very strong emphasis on job security. I don't know where this takes us, but the Labor Party want to put job security into the legislation as one of its primary objects.
I'm fascinated at how this might play out in an unfair dismissal. If Commission members have to take into account job security as one of the objects of the Act, I mean, what does that mean for us?
Well, it also might mean that we might see applications to very modern awards to put more job security type provisions in them. So that's an interesting one. The second one's a biggie. Want to extend the Commission's powers not just to deal with employers and employees, but employee-like forms of work. Very reminiscent of New South Wales many decades ago, where certain classes of technically contractor were deemed to be employees. That then led to Chapter 6 for lorry owner drivers in New South Wales. So we could see the Fair Work Commission's minimum standards starting to be spread outside of the employment relationship.
Clearly, there's a question to be answered on that front. I mean, it's the same problem where you have your menu log case. There is a dissatisfaction on certain, certainly in the Labor Party, that certain forms of work aren't being regulated in an appropriate way because they're not strict employee model type work. So very, very interesting.
And in some areas, I mean, to be in some areas, it is grey. You have to be really honest about that. I mean, you think about some technology companies that we've dealt with where they've got people engaged as contractors who've just simply got an ABN and it's just Jane or John.
Yep.
It looks awfully like an employee, so you kind of understand why the Labor Party might be coming at this in some areas, but perhaps not so much others.
Yep.
Yeah. Bizarrely, they don't like what happened with casual employment over the last 12 months. They're saying their policy is they're going to redefine what a casual is. I've got a view about this, and I think it's going to be pretty horrendous. To be honest, I think their view is, having talked to good friends in the ACTU that I have, they really want to move casual employees to be people who are employed intermittently or irregular arrangements. In other words, what we might call what the ACTU calls a true casual. True casual. Going to be, I mean, if that comes in, that's going to be, we're going to have some really interesting conversations with clients in all sorts of sectors who use casual employees to manage the ups and downs of their sort of demand, their manufacturing, their production, and the like. So I think that's going to be a massive challenge if that comes in.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge for the current system and the critics of the current system is that we'll say that you can make someone a casual by writing their contract so that they're a casual. And
the answer is yes, you can.
That's right. That's in a sentence how it works now. The new test would undermine that and potentially bring back the uncertainty which everyone was living with for the years that we didn't have that test.
And I think from our perspective, if you start to squeeze that side of the equation, then what we'll be looking to do is try and make applications to free up part-time employment. And it might bring back onto the table that thing that the New South Wales Business Chamber had a crack at a couple of years ago, but pulled back on, which was, I forgot what it was called. What do we call it? Permaflex. Permaflex. You know, was you can have certain benefits of ongoing employment, but the employer has certain rostering flexibilities at the same time, and you pay a slight premium for that.
If you tighten up casual employment, you need to loosen up part-time employment. That seems to be the model.
That's the model, and that'll be the interesting argument. The next one doesn't surprise me a whole lot. Limiting the number of fixed-term contracts you can offer somebody before they're really not a fixed-term employee. You and I know there are some sectors where people are on their 13th fixed-term contract in a row. I get it that if you're in a sector that's government-funded, you sometimes tie employment contracts to funding, but I suppose there is a point at which.
Yeah, it depends on the circumstances. I do have some sympathy for the 13th contract in a row type arrangements because there's usually excellent reasons why they do it like that, because tied to funding
or whatever,
class sizes or whatever it is. But the reform point would seek to shut that down, and it's all about security of work again. The idea that you eventually you should have a right to the job, so to speak.
The next one worries me quite a bit, and I'll explain why. But on its face, you could look at it and you could say, well, it probably makes a bit of sense, and that is this notion of having these schemes that the employer pays into that now uniformly across the nation fund annual leave, sick leave, and the like. There are some of these schemes in operation already for most people. So people in the construction sector would know this long service leave scheme that's portable. There's a variety of them. One of the great challenges with this, on its face, you go, well, yeah, maybe that sounds fairly sensible. The great challenge, though, is going to be around things like cash flow if you think about sick leave. So at the moment, annual leave, of course, is provisioned for. Long service leave is provisioned for when you're running a business. Sick leave is cash cost. There's no provision in your balance sheet for sick leave. So if all of a sudden it's contingency based, you may or may not take it. All of a sudden the employer is paying money every week, every month into funds for some of these things that historically they may or may not have paid, it's going to actually increase the cost of doing business in this country quite a bit, particularly around the sick leave one. So we'll be watching that area carefully. At some levels, you go conceptually, perhaps it makes a bit of sense.
I'm also interested in the eligibility of who's in insecure work, because that, when you get that call wrong, it's too late to fix it.
Well, you got the next problem, which we've seen as well, which is if casual employees are beneficiaries of this, then their casual loading's coming down. And you and I know that that's going to upset a lot of casual employees.
Wildly unpopular.
So that'll be interesting. And let's just finish off on the last two, multi-enterprise bargaining. The union movement pushed very aggressively during the Liberal reform process that we went through the working parties. The union movement through the ACTU was pushing very strongly for the introduction of industry-based bargaining. We do actually have multi-employer bargaining available under the Act today, but it's fairly constrained. I've got no doubt that a centrepiece of Labor reform, if they win the election, will be industry-based bargaining. I honestly don't know what that looks like at the moment, but it smells awfully like the way we used to work 30, 40 years ago, when we used to basically bargain at an award level, and the sort of 3 or 4 major companies in the industry would sort of determine what was going to happen. What I would say to most people is, and I said this a few times given political uncertainty, is if you're renegotiating an enterprise agreement now, or you're renegotiating an enterprise agreement, say, in the new year, I would say try and get it done.
Yeah, lock it in.
And go long.
Yep.
Go long. If you can get a 4-year agreement starting in March next year, you might almost jump over a lot of this. You'll get to see, if it does happen, you'll get to see what it looks like. You'll get to see how to play in the new rules. And it's always better to be playing in, 4 years or 3 years down the track than to be the first sort of bunny dealing with a new set of rules that might come in say, October next year or something like that.
Yeah.
So start to think in terms of your enterprise bargaining strategy, where you might want to fit against possible changes from the election.
Can I add another flavour to that? If you're on a zombie agreement, just be aware the Labor's agenda of reform is going to come for your zombie agreement. So you need to be planning. Everyone knows what a zombie agreement is, I assume.
An agreement that was made many years ago, most likely before the Fair Work Act came in, and because of all the transition rules, it's still alive. We've got clients who've got 1990 agreements.
Absolutely.
And ironically, we've got some clients who've got agreements with unions who want to keep those agreements as well. But you're right. I think the Labor Party will look to kill them. And then, as we say, we already said there's a private members bill for same work, same pay, and that's obviously part of their platform for next year as well. It's going to be a big year.
2020.
I'm going to have a holiday. I'm going to have a holiday before we get there. It's going to be a big year. I think we were looking carefully. I think we tried to answer most as they came up. So we'll thank you for your questions as we went. And as always, as I said during the session, if you do want to do a risk assessment and you don't have a risk assessment tool, info@ablawyers.com.au, and we'll send you ours. It's fine, you can have it. That's not a problem. Thanks for the last 12 months. We survived.
So far,
we survived.
Yes.
We've got to get to Christmas. I'm really pleased to have spent so much time working with some amazing clients over the last 12 months. I hope our sort of generous with information approach during the pandemic has helped you. And I wish you every success for your business as we come out of the pandemic. And I hope you have a very safe and a very enjoyable festive season. And I suspect, like us, you deserve a break, and I hope you get it. And we'll see you in the new year. So from us, Julian,
be safe and well. Thank you, Nigel.
And we'll see you in 2022. Take care.
Cheers.